You are saving 20% of your income. You set it up, you automate it, you do not touch it, you followed the rule. You did what the financial advisors, the budgeting books, the personal finance podcasts all told you was the responsible, intelligent, wealth-building thing to do. You feel good about it, and you should, because most Americans are not even close to 20%. And yet something does not add up. The account balances are growing, but not the way retirement commercials suggested they would. The sense that you are building real financial freedom has not quite materialized. You are doing everything right, and yet the math is not landing the way the rule promised it would. Here is what the rule left out. Saving 20% of your income is not the same as building wealth with 20% of your income. Those two things sound identical, but they are not. The number is correct. The percentage is not the problem. The problem is where that 20% is going. And for millions of disciplined, responsible Americans who are proudly saving 20%, a significant portion of that money is sitting in accounts that are quietly, invisibly, mathematically failing them. Think about someone earning $75,000 a year, doing everything right, saving $15,000 annually, watching the balance climb, feeling financially responsible. Over 30 years, that disciplined 20% savings rate, parked in a standard or even moderately performing savings account, produces approximately $200,000 in real purchasing power by retirement. The same person, with the exact same income and the exact same 20% savings rate, but with the money correctly allocated through employer-matched retirement accounts, tax-advantaged instruments, and low-cost broad market investments, arrives at retirement with over $1.5 million in real wealth. Same income, same discipline, same percentage. Gap of over $1.3 million. That gap is not created by luck or inheritance or a higher savings rate. It is created entirely by where the 20% went. And what is worse, the rule itself, save 20%, is specifically designed to prevent you from asking that follow-up question, because once you hit the number, you feel done, you passed, and that, precisely, is the trap. What if everything you were taught about the 20% rule is only half the story? Let's start with where the belief comes from, because it is a belief held by genuinely smart, financially aware people for genuinely logical reasons. The 20% savings rule has been embedded in mainstream American financial advice for decades. It was popularized in part by the 50-30-20 budgeting framework, which suggests allocating 50% of after-tax income to needs, 30% to wants, and 20% to savings. This framework appeared prominently in financial books and columns in the early 2000s and became one of the most repeated pieces of financial guidance in popular culture. Financial advisors, bank websites, money management apps, and personal finance content creators all converged on 20% as the benchmark for responsible saving. It is clean, it is memorable, and it is more ambitious than what the average American actually does, which makes it feel genuinely aspirational. The data on American savings behavior makes 20% savers feel like a distinct, financially responsible minority. According to Bureau of Economic Analysis data, the personal savings rate in the United States has frequently hovered between 3 and 8% over the past several decades. At various points, it has been even lower. Against that backdrop, a person saving 20% of their income is genuinely exceptional. They are outperforming the majority of their peers by a wide margin. The social and psychological feedback that comes with that positioning is powerful and largely positive. You are told, correctly, that you are doing better than most. And the logic of the rule holds up at a surface level. Saving more is better than saving less. Automated savings creates discipline. Building a financial cushion protects you from emergencies. Reducing consumption below income is a prerequisite for wealth. All of these things are true, and the 20% rule encodes them in a simple, actionable target. You hear it, you implement it, and for a very long time it feels like the right move, because compared to not doing it, it absolutely is. The problem only becomes visible when you stop comparing yourself to people saving 3% and start comparing yourself to what your 20% is actually capable of producing. That is the moment the rule starts to crack. So if saving 20% is so wise, why are so many people who follow it still not on track for retirement? Research from the Trans-America Center for Retirement Studies has consistently found a striking gap between Americans' confidence in their retirement savings and the mathematical reality of what they have actually accumulated. A significant portion of people who describe themselves as consistent savers, including many who hit or exceed standard savings benchmarks, report retirement account balances that would not realistically sustain their current lifestyle through a 20 to 30-year retirement. Saving regularly, even at a seemingly impressive rate, does not guarantee retirement readiness if the money is not working hard enough. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, publishes weekly data on the national average interest rate for savings accounts. For most of the decade between 2012 and 2022, that national average sat at or below 0.5% annually. At the same time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that average annual inflation over the past several decades has run at roughly 3%. That means a typical savings account, for the majority of a decade-long period, was not keeping up with inflation. Money parked in it was not merely failing to grow, it was shrinking in real purchasing power at a rate of 2 to 3% per year, silently and invisibly every single year. And yet the 20% rule does not specify where the 20% should go. It just says, save it. For the millions of Americans who heard that rule and faithfully set up a direct deposit to their bank savings account, they have been saving 20% of their income into a vehicle that has historically lost them money after inflation. They followed the rule. The rule did not tell them the rule was incomplete. Here is the real mechanism. The specific financial explanation for why the destination of your savings matters as much as the amount you save, and in some cases more. There are three forces that silently destroy the wealth-building power of 20% savings when it goes to the wrong place. The first is inflation erosion. Money in a standard savings account earns interest at or below the rate of inflation over long periods. The result is that the real purchasing power of your savings declines even as the nominal balance increases. When you deposit $1,000 in a savings account earning 1% annual interest while inflation runs at 3%, after 1 year you have $1,010 nominally, but you can only buy what $980 could have bought when you made the deposit. Multiply that 2% annual real return deficit across $15,000 a year for 30 years, and the compounding math of losing rather than gaining is devastating. The second force is missed compounding in tax-advantaged accounts. A 401k with an employer match is not just an investment account. It is an immediate return on investment that no savings account can replicate. If your employer matches 50% of your contribution up to 6% of your salary, that match alone represents a 50% guaranteed return on those dollars before any market growth occurs. A Roth Individual Retirement Account, or Roth IRA, allows your investments to grow completely tax-free, meaning that $1 of investment at 35, growing at 7% to age 65, becomes $7.60 with no tax liability on the gain. The compounding effect of tax-free growth over 30 years is not incremental. It is transformational. Saving 20% in a standard savings account while leaving this tax-advantaged capacity unused is the financial equivalent of taking a road trip without ever leaving first gear. The third force is the missed multiplier of market returns versus savings rates. The historical average annual return of broad U.S. stock market index funds after adjusting for inflation has been approximately 7% over long periods. The historical real return of money in a standard savings account has been negative over most multi-decade periods. The difference in ending wealth between 20% invested at 7% real return versus 20% saved at negative 2% real return, compounded over 30 years, is not a modest margin. It is the difference between $1.5 million and $200,000 on the same income and the same savings discipline. The gap is entirely about vehicle, not effort. Now here's the question the math alone cannot answer. Why do so many financially aware, intentional people not figure this out on their own? The answer lies in a combination of three psychological patterns that behavioral economists have documented with remarkable consistency across diverse financial populations. The first is what researchers call loss aversion asymmetry applied to financial instruments. Market-based investments fluctuate in value. Savings accounts do not. Even though the long-term expected return of a diversified index fund dramatically exceeds that of a savings account, the experience of watching an account balance drop by 10% during a market correction creates a psychological discomfort that is approximately twice as painful, in neurological terms, as the pleasure of watching it rise by 10%. For many people, the certainty of a modest guaranteed return feels more comfortable than the uncertainty of a higher expected return with visible short-term volatility. This is not irrational. It is a deeply human response to loss. But applied to long-term investing, it produces a systematic bias toward under-allocation in the instruments most capable of generating real wealth. The second pattern is status quo bias. Once you have established the habit of saving 20% and chosen where that money goes, there is a powerful psychological resistance to changing the setup. The account feels familiar. The process is automated. Revisiting the allocation requires mental effort and confronting uncertainty. Most people who set up automatic savings transfers in their late 20s or early 30s are still routing money to the same accounts a decade later, even if the market for high-yield instruments, tax-advantaged accounts, or investment products has changed meaningfully. The default becomes permanent not by design but by inertia. The third and perhaps most financially damaging pattern is what I call compliance satisfaction. The 20% rule is a clear pass-fail benchmark. Once you pass it, your financial brain registers the task as complete. You did the thing you were supposed to do. You belong to the responsible minority. The feedback loop closes. And this closure, this sense of having done enough, is precisely what prevents you from asking the critical follow-up question, is my 20% working as hard as it possibly could? Most people never ask that question not because they are lazy or uninformed, but because the rule itself told them they were done the moment they hit the number. Let me make this concrete with two real American households. Both have the same income. Lisa and Brian both earn $75,000 a year. Both have been faithful to the 20% rule for 12 years, saving $15,000 annually, starting at age 30. Both have the exact same savings discipline. But the destination of their 20% is completely different. Lisa's 20% goes into her bank savings account. For most of the past 12 years, that account has earned well below 1% annually. She has a balance of approximately $195,000. In real, inflation-adjusted purchasing power at today's dollars, that balance represents roughly $140,000 of actual wealth. Brian's 20% goes to his employer, sponsored 401k first, capturing his company's 3% match on top of his own contributions. The remainder goes into a Roth IRA maxed to the annual limit each year, invested in a total market index fund. At a 7% real annual return over 12 years, Brian's account balance is approximately $315,000 in today's purchasing power. Add the value of the employer match he has captured over that period, and the figure approaches $370,000. Lisa and Brian are both 42 years old. Both have been exactly as disciplined. The gap between them at this point is already approximately $230,000, created entirely by allocation. But this is where the story becomes genuinely dramatic, because neither of them is retired yet. In the 23 years between 42 and 65, Lisa's $140,000 in real value, if now redirected to proper investment at 7%, grows to approximately $720,000. Brian's $370,000 grows to approximately $1.9 million. The retirement wealth gap between two people who saved the exact same percentage of the exact same income for 35 years is approximately $1.2 million. That gap was never about how much they saved. It was always about where. Here is the framework for fixing this, not from theory, from your actual accounts, starting today. The first action is an audit. Log in right now, today, to every account where your 20% is going and identify exactly what each dollar is doing. How much is in a standard or high-yield savings account above your emergency fund threshold? How much is in your 401k? And inside that 401k, what fund type is it invested in? This last question is critical and almost nobody checks. Millions of Americans have their 401k contributions sitting in a default fund, often a stable value fund, money market fund, or even a target date fund with a very conservative allocation that behaves much more like a savings account than an equity investment. The contribution is being made correctly. The fund choice is silently costing them decades of compounding. The second action is to restructure the priority order of where your 20% goes. The optimal allocation sequence for most Americans earning between $55,000 and $120,000 a year looks like this. First, direct enough to your 401k to capture the full employer match. Every dollar of employer match is an immediate 100% return. No investment in the world reliably competes with that. Second, fully fund a high-yield savings account to 3 to 6 months of essential expenses as your emergency fund, and then stop adding to savings accounts. Everything beyond that emergency threshold should not be in a savings account. Third, contribute to your Roth IRA to the annual maximum, which is $7,000 per year in 2025 and 2026 for those under 50. Fourth, return to your 401k and increase contributions toward the annual limit of $23,500. Fifth, if your 20% savings capacity extends beyond these tax advantage limits, open a taxable brokerage account and invest in low-cost broad market index funds. The third action is to fix the fund selection inside your retirement accounts. Within your 401k and your Roth IRA, every dollar should be in the lowest cost, most broadly diversified equity index funds available on the platform. Look for total U.S. market index funds, broad international index funds, and if you want some fixed income exposure, low-cost bond index funds. The expense ratio, the annual fee the fund charges, should ideally be below 0.1%. If you are currently in actively managed funds with expense ratios above 1%, you are paying for underperformance at a compound cost over 30 years that can easily reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. The best fund is almost always the one with the lowest fee that covers the broadest market. The fourth action is to eliminate any high-interest debt that is counteracting your savings rate. If you are saving 20% while simultaneously carrying credit card debt at 18 to 24% annual interest, your net effective wealth building rate is negative. The interest cost on that debt exceeds any return your savings can realistically generate. Paying off high-interest consumer debt is not a detour from wealth building. It is the highest return investment available to you until the balance is zero. The fifth action is to review your 20% once a year, every year, specifically asking the question, is each dollar of this 20% in the highest performing available allocation for my tax situation and time horizon? The goal is not perfection. The goal is that your 20% is never sitting passively in an account that loses to inflation when a higher return alternative is accessible. One annual review, with the intention of catching and correcting any drift back toward low-yield defaults, is enough to stay on the optimal path. Now let's project forward. Picture your financial life 5, 10, and 20 years from today under two scenarios. In scenario 1, your 20% continues routing to savings accounts and low-yield defaults. In 10 years, your nominal balance has grown, but your real purchasing power has barely kept pace with inflation. In 20 years, you have a meaningful cushion, but the compound growth engine that would have made the difference between a secure retirement and an anxious one was never truly switched on. At 65, you have enough to feel okay, but not enough to feel free. The retirement looks similar to the working years. Careful, constrained, built around what you can afford rather than what you genuinely want. In scenario 2, you make the allocation changes described above today. In 5 years, the difference between your accounts and scenario 1 is already visible. Tens of thousands of dollars in compounded growth that did not exist before. In 10 years, the gap is in the six-figure range. The compounding acceleration that comes from tax-free growth in the Roth IRA, employer match returns, and 7% real equity returns is moving faster every year. In 20 years, you are looking at a portfolio that is very likely to cross $1 million and potentially double it, built from the same income and the same percentage you were always committed to. At 65, you have optionality. The choice of when to retire, how to retire, what that life looks like. Those choices belong to you, not to your account balance. The only difference between those two scenarios is not discipline. You already have discipline. It is not income. You already have income. It is not even the percentage. You already have the percentage. It is 3 hours of account restructuring. That is the actual size of the task standing between where you are and where scenario 2 takes you. Here is the insight to take with you. The 20% rule is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that costs the people who follow it most faithfully the most. The rule tells you how much to save. It does not tell you that saving 20% in the wrong account for 30 years produces less than 15% of the real wealth that correctly allocated 20% would produce. That part was always the more important half of the advice, and it was never mentioned. The one action step you can take today is simple. Pull up your savings accounts and your retirement accounts right now and ask one question. How much of my 20% is invested in vehicles growing at 7% or more in real terms? And how much is sitting in savings accounts earning less than inflation? Whatever the answer is, it tells you exactly where the gap is. Fixing the gap does not require saving more. It only requires saving smarter. And now you know exactly what smarter looks like.